Alright, y'all, welcome to the last section of AP Microeconomics. We're looking at income inequality here as a market failure. So like I've said before, if we're looking at our free market competition as a competition, any competition has winners and losers. Now the gap between the winners and losers is kind of what we're looking at here, right? In our country, we have the wealthiest people in the world, but we also have really high rates of homelessness, right? So we look at both ends of the spectrum here. Whereas a command economy is going to focus more on that economic equity, making sure that everybody has the bare essentials and there's some level of fairness. And a free market economy, it's survival of the fittest, right? And so that carries its own issues with it. So we're looking at income inequality here, the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient, which should be new to you, but the ideas that it's showing aren't really new to you. So we're looking at how free market economies kind of naturally lead to these gaps in income, right? That since I've been at Brunswick High, my income hasn't really grown a whole lot, but if you look at celebrities, the average celebrity is making way more now than they were 10 years ago. And so that gap between rich and poor, not that I'm poor necessarily, is just getting kind of larger and larger each year. So let's take a look at how we measure that. You don't need to write this part down, but when we're looking at the average income of somebody, making $76,000, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot, the per capita income, because it's not showing us, all right, how many of those people are Elon Musks that make billions of dollars? How many people make absolutely nothing, right? So the problem with averages is that they hide a lot of reality. So if we're looking at how the government, measures this distribution of income, we call this the Lorenz curve. It's a tool that we're going to look at in just a minute. And Ms. Slack, if you would click on the link for this video right here, I do think it's very good. It's worth pausing and kind of watching through it, looking at how our distribution of wealth is kind of skewed in the country. All right, so to start out with, when we're looking at this Lorenz curve, essentially the way that it works is the same thing that it shows in that video. You're taking all of the people in our country and dividing them up into 5 equal groups, quintiles. From the poorest Americans to the richest Americans, we're breaking them up into the 20 percentile groups. If we had pure socialism, which hasn't ever happened anywhere in the world, but in theory, what it would look like is everybody receiving an equal cut, which on its own isn't necessarily desirable either, right? There'd be no incentive to work harder or develop yourself more. If everybody's making the same amount of money, you're losing out this individual incentive that you have in a free market economy. So pure socialism would be 20% of the population receiving 20% of the wealth, 40% of the population receiving 40% of the wealth. But what we're looking at with this Lorenz curve is comparing countries to that perfect equality. Right, that would be perfect equality, but it would come with loss of efficiency. So just as a scenario here, if our economy has $100 in it, and the lowest income people in our country, the lowest 20%, collectively have $5, that $5 would represent 5% of the income, of $100. Now, if we're looking at group 2, if collectively they have $10, that's 10% of the income. Group 3's got 15, that's 15%. Now, if we framed it as looking at the lowest 60 percentile, that would be adding these up together, right? The poorest 30 or 60% of our country has 15, 25, 30% of the wealth. Or if we're looking at the lowest 80% of our income, of our population, it'd be 25, 40, 50, 55% of the income. Or we could say the wealthiest 20% would have 45% of our income. So we broke it up into these quintiles, into this 20 percentile or 20% groups. Now we take that information and we can graph it out on this Lorenz curve. So if we're looking at this straight line, what it represents is perfect equality. And you need to be able to graph this out in case it comes up on an FRQ. The variables you're measuring here is the percentage of income and the percentage of the population, in this case, percentage of the families. So the straight line here represents perfect equality. 20% of the population has 20% of the income. 40% of the population has 40%. 60, 60, 80, 80, 100, 100. Which again, perfect socialism, perfect equality here, which again has its own issues, but that's just kind of the baseline that we base it off of. So then what that tells us then with this Lorenz curve is that there's not equality in any country, right? That this, if we're looking at 20% of the population here controlling 5%, this isn't the US data or anything, but a hypothetical country, 20% of the population controlling 5% of the wealth, 40% of the population controlling 15%, 60% control. And so what this is showing us, the further away we get from this line, the more income inequality we see, the less money is evenly distributed throughout the economy. So we've got the actual distribution, and then we've got the perfect distribution, then we've got the actual distribution. We call this the Lorenz banana, interestingly enough. So the banana shows how much income inequality we have. So the size of the banana, the further we go out, the less income is evenly distributed. And we'll look at the United States in just a minute, because ours is skewed pretty far. But the further away we get from this straight line, the less income is evenly distributed, the more income is going towards the top. Now, this Gini coefficient is how we kind of measure mathematically income inequality. This kind of question's never popped up on the AP test before as far as doing the math, but they have asked like what it is. So the Gini coefficient is measuring this income inequality, right? So if we're looking at how we do it, let's say that this side of the square represents 100% of all income, right? So that would be areas A and B combined is 100% of the income. Or to make it into a decimal, it's just 100% 1. Let's say that this area right here, A, represents 30% of this half of the square. So that would be 30% or 0.3. If we do 0.3 divided by 1, it just comes out to 0.3. So that coefficient's pretty low. Now, let's say that we're looking at a different country that has more income inequality. That line is going to be further out. It's going to look something like that. Let's call this, country C. Let's say that this area represents 70% of this box right here. So if we're looking at this Gini coefficient, it would be the area of point A, or area of A, which is 0.7, over that whole area, A and B together. Let's call that 1. In that case, this coefficient is 0.7. So the bigger that coefficient is, the more income inequality we have. If one person had all of the wealth in our country, then it would go all the way out to here. One person has complete control over the wealth in our economy. In that case, it would be 1, right? One person is controlling 100% of the wealth. So the further away we get from this line, the more income inequality we see. The less money is held in the hands of lower income people, the more money is held into the hands of higher income people. And if you look at this Lorenz curve, it's growing every year. That gap between rich and poor and how much control over the nation's wealth lower income people have is getting less and less. And that's kind of what you saw in the video a minute ago. And that video is close to a decade old at this point. And that gap has only gotten larger over that time period. So like I said, with that Gini coefficient, the higher that number is, the more income inequality there is, right? The further this line goes, the more of this area it's eating up. A lower number means less income inequality. Now, I do want you to write this down. These transfer payments that we've talked about before, welfare, food stamps, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the purpose of all of these is that the government takes taxes out of people's paychecks and they redistribute it to people that need it, the elderly, people that are low income, people that are disabled, people without jobs. It redistributes that income. And so what we see here is as the government uses these transfer payments, it takes money more away from higher income people and distributes it more to lower income people in theory, right? Which pushes this Lorenz curve inwards and it gets us closer to that level of income equality. So we're gonna look at different types of taxes in a minute, but that's kind of the goal of it, right? That I arguably should pay a higher tax rate than you because I can afford it, right? When we looked at our paychecks in here, or I guess maybe we didn't, we maybe ran short on time, but y'all's income tax bracket's about 10%, mine is closer to 20%. My wife makes more money than I do, she's in the 22% tax bracket. So the more money you make, the more heavily you're taxed. I can pull up that tax bracket real quick. So yeah, if you made between $0 and $11,000 last year, your tax rate would be 10%. I made between $48,000 and $103,000 last year, so mine would be 22%. My wife made between $100,000 and $197,000, so she'd be 24%. So the more money you make, the more heavily you're taxed. and then that money is redistributed back down to people with lower income. So that would push this Lorenz curve inwards and would make things more evenly distributed. Now, just kind of taking a look at two different countries, I wanted to look at the Australia and the US. So what this curve is telling us here, first off, the x-axis is the percentage of the population, the y-axis is the income. So 20% of Australia's population controls about 10% of the income. 40% of the population controls about 20%, 60% of the population controls about 40%. So it's not evenly distributed, but it's not terrible. If we look at the United States though, like reading what this graph is telling us, 80% of the population controls less than 20% of the wealth. Or to put that in the other direction, 20% of the population controls about 90% of the wealth. So we have very high levels of income inequality in our country. That's what this Lorenz curve is telling us. Now, I don't think it's going to let me zoom in on this at all, but if we look at the fact that this red line is beneath zero on this, we need to think about what that really means. It means that this bottom 20% here, even close up to the 30 and 40% mark, have negative wealth. They have debt, right? So that they control less than 0% of the country's wealth because they owe so much money. So this Lorenz curve again here is telling us a comparison to perfect equality. Pure socialism, everybody's getting paid the same amount, right? The further away we get from this line, the more income equality we see. So 60% of our population controls maybe 5% of the wealth, 80% controls something like 10% of the wealth. But when we get into that 90% bracket and higher, that's where it gets exponentially larger. And so some of the issues we see here is that as that gap gets larger and larger, it gets harder and harder to get out of poverty, right? And so that's kind of one of the big issues that we're looking at with economics is what kind of issues might be created due to these uneven distributions of wealth. And this is looking at countries based on this Gini coefficient. So the higher the number is, the more inefficient or the more unequal it is. So the United States ranks 5 in the world, or 5th in the world. The only countries with more unequal distribution of wealth: Bulgaria, Turkey, Mexico, Costa Rica, and it goes down from there. Now, if we're looking at what we're doing to try to level out that income inequality, it's these safety net programs that I kind of mentioned earlier, right? Any kind of transfer payment, retirement, unemployment, where money's being taken out of people's paycheck and redistributed to people that need it. The idea is that reduces that income inequality. We're not all taxed the same amount. The more money you make, we have a progressive tax system. The more money you make, the more heavily you're taxed. And so the goal is to try to reduce that inequality. So looking at these 3 different types of taxes, first off, the purpose of taxes, A is to raise revenue for the government so we can fund the military or healthcare or schools. Secondly, we use it as an incentive, right? We raise taxes on things that we want to discourage. We lower taxes on things that we want to encourage. You get tax breaks for doing good things. So we use taxes as incentives to influence behavior. But we also use it as a way of kind of balancing out our economy. We break up taxes into these 3 different categories. Progressive taxes are like what we looked at with income tax a second ago. The more money you make, the more progressively or the more it's going to affect you, right? If you're only making $10,000 a year, your tax bracket's going to be about 10%. If you make $500,000 this year, your tax bracket's going to be closer to 30%. So the more money you make, the more heavily you're taxed. The lower you make, the less you're taxed. A proportional tax is going to affect everybody the same way. Now, normally I would sit down and look through my pay stub and one of y'all's pay stubs as well, and we would do the math on this. But if you look at Medicare as an example on this, next time you get a paycheck, take a look at it. Divide your Medicare tax by your income, and what you should see is that everybody in this room pays about 1.4% of their paychecks towards Medicare. Doesn't matter if you're a millionaire, doesn't matter if you're minimum wage, everybody gets taxed that same amount. That would be a proportional tax or a flat tax. Everybody's getting taxed the same amount. And then finally, a regressive tax is one that affects lower income people more. And if we take a look at sales tax as a good example here, sales tax affects you all a lot more than it affects me, right? So let's say that you made $8,000 last year. Chances are you probably had to spend every penny of that, right? Especially if you're living out on your own, that's barely going to make ends meet. So if you're spending 100% of your income, then all of that is going to be affected by this 7% sales tax. All of your income is going to be hit by that regressive tax. But let's say that my wife and I together make 150 grand. We're able to save and invest half of it, and we spend the other half of it. Well, only half of our income is going to be affected by that sales tax then. So it's going to affect those lower income people more than it's going to affect us because it's affecting less of our income. The more money you can save, the more money you can invest, the less that regressive tax, the less that sales tax is going to hurt you. So again, just to kind of go over them, progressive taxes are what we use to try to bring about more evenly distributed wealth, right? We're taking money away from higher income people and giving it to lower income people in the form of those transfer payments, welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Section 8, all of those are taking money out and then putting it somewhere else in our economy. Progressive taxes are affecting everybody the same way. A regressive tax is disproportionately affecting lower income people. Right, and that's the last new concept that I wanted to take a look at. Congratulations, you all are done with AP Micro. I hope you're giving yourself a big round of applause now. I've got some review videos that we're going to look at over the next couple weeks. We're going to get nice and prepped for the AP test. I'm going to send you some cute pictures of my baby. But I'm really, really proud of all of you, and I can't wait to see all the great things y'all do, and I can't wait to see y'all at graduation too. So see you guys at grad practice. Be nice to Miss Slack.